Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is James Buchanan Part 2. We stopped last time in 1840. James Buchanan was a loyal member of the Democratic Party, and it was a presidential election year. The nominee for the Democrats was Martin Van Buren, and James Buchanan campaigned hard for him. However, Van Buren lost in his attempt for re-election. James Buchanan had this to say about his efforts campaigning for Martin Van Buren, quote, "The effect of frequently addressing immense multitudes of people in the open air is more severe than I expected." His biographer Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan much preferred his usual method of campaigning by pen." So he was not big. He was good talking to people in small groups, one-on-one, but not a great public speaker. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan had developed a reputation for being unwilling to fight on his own behalf. This trait governed much of his political thinking, and no phase of his character bred more doubts, misunderstandings, and contempt among his contemporaries. But he had talent for clear thinking, but none for self-dramatization. He brought to the senatorship great seriousness of purpose, readiness to debate, and forensic ability, loyalty to party, and diligence in seeking facts." So that was all very good. Fine statement about James Buchanan. James Buchanan had this to say in 1841, quote, "This federal government is nothing but a system of restraints from beginning to end. Mutual forbearance, mutual accommodation, the avoidance of extremes, the willingness of the majority to extend some consideration to the minority, the acceptance of compromise as the only method short of war or despotism for settling political disputes. These attitudes alone could perpetuate self-government and the federal system." Those are all fine sentiments. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan uniformly took the long view. His recommendations on domestic and foreign policy, though attacked at one time or another by every geographic section, were consistent and remarkably sound. At the base lay the conviction that political power, in whatever form it existed, must always be held in check, and that the United States Constitution provided all the necessary machinery necessary for that purpose. Buchanan remained continually alert to partisan attacks upon the delicate balances which the Constitution provided. Throughout his political career, Buchanan could be found among those who tried to define clearly and keep strong the delicate lines which separated the three branches of government and the functions of state and federal administrations." That's a fine praise for James Buchanan, the importance of the separation of powers and the balance between state and federal governments for American democracy. Now, the slavery issue continued to be a bigger and bigger problem, more of a conflict for the country. And he had this to say, James Buchanan, on the issue of slavery, quote, "If the progress of the abolition societies cannot be arrested, I fear the catastrophe," in other words, civil war, may come sooner than any of us anticipate. Would it not be well to get up counter societies of friends of the Union? Regarding the abolition movement, Buchanan continues, quote, "Before this unfortunate agitation commenced, a very large and growing party existed in several of the slave states in favor of the gradual abolition of slavery, and now that voice is no longer heard in support of such a measure." Buchanan believed that the abolition movement had postponed emancipation of the slaves by 50 years. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of others felt the same way. Of course, slavery was terrible, but it was a reality, and it was a very tough issue. And guys like Buchanan were dedicated to keeping the country together, and the abolition movement. Of course, slavery was dividing the country, and the abolition movement was adding to that division. So it was this ongoing problem. Now, he continued to be a single man. However, in 1843, James Buchanan had a romantic interest in Anne Payne, the niece of Dolly Madison, the widow of former President James Madison, and he wrote her this poem, quote, In thee my chilled and blighted heart has found a green spot in the dreary waste around. Oh, that my fate in my youthful days had been! I have lived with such an unknown unseen, loving and loved to have passed away our days, sequestered from the world's malignant gaze. A match of age with youth can bring the farce of winter dancing with the spring. Blooming 19 can never well agree with the dull age of half a century. Thus reason speaks, what rebel passion hates, passion which would control the very fates. Meantime, where'er you go, where'er your lot, by me you'll never, never be forgot. May heaven's rich blessings crown your future life, and may you be a happy, loving wife. In other words, he did not believe that the two of them were going to had a future together because of the age difference. He was too old, he had too many nieces and nephews to support, and he was too busy with his political career. Of course, he never did get married. At one point, he wrote that it was, quote, not good for man to be alone, and I should not be astonished to find myself married to some old maid who can nurse me when I am sick, provide good dinners for me when I am well, and not expect from me any very ardent or romantic affection. Not a great sell for any woman interested in him. And of course, he never did get married, but it was something he thought about. 1844 was another presidential election year, and the Democrats got the White House back. James K. Polk was elected, and in 1845, the following year, James Buchanan became Secretary of State under President Polk. So his political career continued to rise. Secretary of State was considered the stepping stone to the presidency at that time. President Polk had this to say about his Secretary of State, James Buchanan, quote, Buchanan is an able man, but in small matters without judgment, and sometimes acts like an old maid. Secretary of State Buchanan negotiated with the British regarding Oregon and the border of the U.S. and British Canada, and with Mexico after the Mexican War regarding the new territory to be added. James Buchanan had this to say, quote, the constitutional rights of the South under our constitutional compact are as much entitled to protection as those of any other portion of our Union. So you see, he was expressing this desire to keep the country together, to satisfy North and South. 1845, Secretary of State James Buchanan hosted a ball, and he served a lot of really good food, including venison, ham, beef, turkey, pheasant, chicken, oysters, lobster, ice cream, water ice, Charlotte russ, punch, fruit and cake pyramids, blancmange, apple toddy, kisses, chocolate coffee, 300 bottles of wine, and 150 bottles of champagne. Distinguished guests at that ball included Dolly Madison, widow of former President James Madison, and the widow of Alexander Hamilton. So a big party. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, James Buchanan felt himself superior to James K. Polk in understanding of international affairs, but he soon learned that President Polk outranked him and intended to use his authority. The two continually disagreed on matters of policy, of timing, of procedure, and of emphasis. Polk sensed condescension in Buchanan, which toughened his own attitude. Well, they were able to work, I would say, pretty well together, President Polk and Secretary of State Buchanan. 1846, James Buchanan in June was able to finalize a treaty which settled the Oregon question, the border between the United States and British Canada in the northwest at the 49-degree latitude, which became the border between the two countries up until now. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, the negotiations raised Buchanan's prestige in foreign courts and drew from Queen Victoria the statement that she liked Mr. Buchanan's treaty. James Buchanan sensed that James K. Polk, President Polk, often appeared to differ with him, more to protect the presidential prerogative and to assert command than for reasons substantially bearing on the subject at issue. So, well, they were two strong-willed people, and Buchanan was older and had an awful lot of experience, but as I said, they were able to work well together. James Buchanan wrote this quote in 1846, "To be Secretary of State is not what it is cracked up to be. Here I am sitting in a hot room, engaged from morning till night, and often after night, at a season of the year when I had been free as mountain breezes." His summer vacation was cut short. Summer of 1846, trouble with Mexico. Of course, we were headed toward war, the Mexican War. And there was also a treaty signed with New Granada, which is now northern South America, like Colombia, Venezuela, regarding Panama, which was a part of that country that broke up. And a treaty was signed in which the U.S. had expressed an interest in building a railroad or a canal. Of course, that took many years later. Finally, the Panama Canal was built under an independent Panama. President Polk said this, quote, "Mr. Buchanan is an able man." 1848, James Buchanan had developed a nervous tic in his leg and had a painful tumor in his nose. He had a series of operations for these medical issues. Regarding his work as Secretary of State, James Buchanan said, quote, "My life is that of a galley slave. I have not read 30 consecutive pages in any book since I came into the Department of State." Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan respected President Polk's conscientious and unremitting application of duty." Again, so they had respect for each other. By 1849, Buchanan was happy to leave the State Department, actually, as the Whigs were able to win the White House in the 1848 election when Zachary Taylor was elected. By the spring of 1849, Buchanan went home to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was the first time in over 30 years that he held no public office. As I said, the Democrats were out of power in the White House as Zachary Taylor and the Whigs were in the White House. Slavery continued to be a growing source of conflict for the country. Buchanan was 58 years old. One of his biographers, Gene H. Baker, wrote, quote, "He had changed from an energetic party enthusiast into an overweight, ambivalently ambitious politician." So he still had ambitions for the presidency, but he didn't know what the future held. Gene H. Baker wrote about James Buchanan, quote, "With his tilted head, protruding stomach, diminutive lower body, and heavily lidded eyes, one sometimes shut, he resembled an erect, two-footed tyrannosaur." James Buchanan bought a home on the outskirts of Lancaster, which he called Wheatland. It was a massive 3-story brick house with 22 rooms. Now you say, why would he need all this room? He was single. He had his brother. He had brothers and sisters who had either died or who were destitute, and so he had 22 nieces and nephews in need. So he did fill up that house with nieces and nephews, and he was supporting them. So even though he never married, he had all these young people that he was raising as a second father. And during this time, he received the nickname the Sage of Wheatland. In the old days, people would name their homes, like Mount Vernon, Monticello, and so forth. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan agreed with Andrew Jackson that no man could achieve the presidency who appeared actively to seek it, and that the successful candidate must display utter indifference until he was called to duty." That's how it used to be. You had to act like you didn't want to be president. So again, this country estate was a mile west of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He had 22 nieces and nephews, 13 grandnephews and nieces, and 7 full orphans in his care. In his garden, he had 1,200 strawberry plants, and he enjoyed sleighing in the winter. In April of 1850, Buchanan said this, quote, The place now begins to look beautiful, and we have concerts of birds every morning. His one niece, Harriet Lane, was 19 years old, and she became the leader. She was like a daughter for him, and she was the female head of the household. Now Buchanan loved reading. He had time to read. During this time, he read a 5-volume biography of George Washington. Wonderful. He also read books by Lord Byron and Sir Walter Scott and Charles Dickens. These were the happiest, most carefree time in his life. He reveled in his freedom from political work, reading books, organizing his garden, entertaining overnight visitors, and enjoying cigars and rye whiskey, writing letters, and frequenting the Lancaster taverns. Again, he was still interested in becoming president. He still had that ambition. And the 1852 election was coming. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous author, had this to say about James Buchanan, that he was, quote, heavy and sensible, cool, kindly, and good-humored, with a great deal of experience. He was doing well financially because of his successful legal career, and he was in good health, had a good appetite, and according to Philip S. Klein, quote, a wonderful vaulted wine cellar, fit for the vintages he now began to collect, with the appreciation of a connoisseur. But rich and satisfying as were the maintenance of a family homestead and the Epicurean delights of a country squire, politics absorbed James Buchanan's deepest interest and thought. So he was maintaining contact with his friends in the political world, especially in Washington. Now, 1852 was an election year, and the Democratic Party nomination was something he hoped to receive. And he had this to say, quote, if success attends me, very well. If not, defeat will cost me neither a night's rest nor a meal's victuals or victuals. Thank heaven, I know how to be happy in retirement. Well, his retirement continued because Franklin Pierce was nominated by the Democratic Party and elected president in 1852. Now, Buchanan was a strong contender, did not receive the nomination, however. And he had this to say, quote, my friends have fought a good fight and have deserved success. It was not their fault if they could not command it. For the first time I have had a fair trial and have been fairly defeated. Now, the same year, in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was published, and this really strengthened the anti-slavery movement in the United States and made people more, and again, really contributed to the division, and eventually the end of the horrible practice of slavery through the Civil War. 1853, Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, it suddenly occurred to the sage of Wheatland that he was getting old. He enjoyed joking about himself as a middle-aged fogey, but now he wrote, I am surely becoming an old fogey and have got far behind the rapid march of the age. I am rapidly becoming a petrifaction. In truth, I daily become more and more fond of my retirement, and always feel reluctant to leave home, though this I am often compelled to do. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, it seemed a long while since anyone had called him Jimmy. Now he was Old Buck. By 1853, the Democrats were back in the White House under President Pierce, and James Buchanan was back in politics. He was appointed U.S. ambassador to Great Britain under President Franklin Pierce. So he was back in the fray. And, of course, he had always been interested in foreign policy. He was bored in retirement, wanted to stay in the public eye. He spent 3 years in Great Britain. One of the major issues that he dealt with was the British colony in Central America, which was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. He met Queen Victoria. Now, there was a major controversy over Buchanan's clothes for official visits in London, because Buchanan wore plain clothes, not the expected fancy ones, and the British were offended, but Americans were happy about that development. He departed August of 1853. He sailed from New York City to Liverpool on the steamer Atlantic. And his instructions were to perform his duties wearing the simple dress of an American citizen and avoid the gold lace, ribbons, jewels, patent leather boots, and aristocratic gewgaws. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, James Buchanan had often ridiculed the Peacock Parade and urged the adoption of such a rule. But at the court of St. James, it gave him serious trouble. It was considered disrespectful to appear before the Queen of England in street clothes, and there was a storm of indignation in Great Britain. The British public were upset. Gene H. Baker wrote, quote, few episodes in the period so strikingly differentiated what Americans considered their democracy of the people from the snobbery of the English class system. Twisting the tail of the British lion had long been popular American sport, and the fact that one of the nation's diplomats had successfully challenged the foppish customs of the English earned Buchanan the respect of many Americans. Now, one of the things Buchanan was negotiating with the British, hoping that Great Britain would pressure Spain to sell Cuba to the United States for $100 million. Spain was in debt to British banks, so there was this idea that they would succumb to this pressure. There was also talk of taking Cuba by force. Some feared a slave rebellion in Cuba, and it would become another Haiti, another black republic. Again, this was a controversial topic. Obviously, it didn't happen. The United States did not purchase Spain. Of course, eventually they did in the Spanish-American War, but that was many years in the future. And the conflict over slavery was continuing. Regarding James Buchanan in London, Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, it took some time to become accustomed to dinners at 8 and parties at 11, when he should have been going to bed. His niece Harriet visited London. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, Harriet became a favorite in the diplomatic social world. She dined with Queen Victoria, danced with Prince Albert, flitted from castle to castle, attended fashionable weddings, and kept the legation in constant turmoil with preparations for parties. Now, during her time visiting her uncle, her sister Mary suddenly died in California, and the news arrived in London, and Harriet was inconsolable. Philip S. Klein described, quote, James Buchanan gave her some of his own philosophy. To mourn the dead at the expense of the living is sinful. Heart-rending afflictions are the common lot of humanity. Man's duty on earth is to submit with humble resignation. Buchanan said this, quote, in all calamitous events, we ought to say emphatically, thy will be done. Late in the year, there was a threat of war between the United States and Great Britain regarding the British territory in Central America, which is now, it was at one time called British Honduras, now it's Belize, a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. But that was avoided. There was the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, and the two countries agreed to build a canal jointly. Of course, that did not happen, and the Panama Canal wouldn't be built for many years until 1914. It would be finished. Regarding the 1856 presidential election, quote, Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, the country was fearful to the verge of panic. Everyone wanted the next president to be a statesman, a man whose integrity had been proven over the years. In short, James Buchanan. Of course, Buchanan's ambitions continued. He returned to the United States in April. There was war in Kansas between the anti-slavery government and the pro-slavery people. In Topeka, the anti-slavery government in Topeka had a law making it illegal for blacks to enter Kansas. So even though they were against slavery, they were also racist. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, Wheatland beckoned strongly, and life there looked heavenly in comparison with the presidency of a country in political shambles, and with a civil war at its center. So crossing the Atlantic Ocean, there was a newspaper story that James Buchanan would return via New Orleans, go to Tennessee, and marry Mrs. Polk, the widow of James K. Polk. interesting story. A lady passenger on the ship said to Buchanan that this would be an agreeable way of poking your way into the presidency. So that's pretty funny. Some historical humor from 1856. Now, back in that time and for many years, the presidential politics was a front porch campaign. The politicians did not travel. They stayed at home and they let others speak for them. But James Buchanan had this to say in 1856, quote, "Disunion is a word which ought not to be breathed amongst us, even in a whisper. Our children ought to be taught that it is a sacrilege to pronounce it. There is nothing stable but heaven and the Constitution." So you can see his dedication to keeping the country together, which is so important. On May 22nd, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina beat Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner into unconsciousness with a heavy rubber cane. Sumner was an abolitionist, and this was part of the conflict over slavery. The country was headed towards civil war. Eventually, Sumner did recover, but he was beaten terribly. Now, the Democratic Convention in 1856 was in Cincinnati. President Franklin Pierce was the incumbent president. He hoped to be nominated. Stephen Douglas was also a presidential contender, also Lewis Cass and James Buchanan. James Buchanan was nominated on the 18th ballot to become the Democratic nominee for president in the 1856 election. His vice presidential nominee was John Breckinridge. The Republican Party was the alternate, and they were considered, or at least they had radical elements. They had different ideas, and they were an anti-slavery party. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "If they were victorious, the Republican platform pledged them to arrest, jail, and possibly execute those who disagreed with them on Kansas." One politician had this to say, quote, "Can the Republicans have the madness or folly to believe that our Southern brethren would submit to be governed by such a chief magistrate? I tell you, we are treading on the brink of a volcano. People who still loved their country were frightened." Now, there were some Republicans, again, they had a wide range of ideas, but some of the radical Republicans were talking that they hoped that there would be a slave rebellion to end slavery, or that there would be a war fought to end slavery, that the country should be broken up to end slavery, and so forth. So this was all, they were so radical that they were willing to end the Union. And I guess not all Republicans believed that, but some did. And the sentiment, there was an idea in the South that if the Republicans, that if a Republican president was nominated, that would lead to the dissolution of the United States. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "Southerners declared that if the Republicans won, they would have to secede immediately to save their lives." So in 1856, the election came up, and James Buchanan won to become the 15th president as the Democratic nominee. He defeated John C. Fremont, who was the Republican nominee, also known as the Pathfinder, the celebrated Western explorer. Abraham Lincoln campaigned hard for Fremont, made 50 speeches for him. Now, Buchanan's niece Harriet became the First Lady, and some have said that that was the first use of that term. Others have said differently. And Philip S. Klein, regarding the election of James Buchanan, said, quote, "The Union was saved." In other words, the election of a Democrat satisfied the South, meaning they would not leave the Union. Gene H. Baker wrote, quote, "In his years as president, Buchanan did a great deal to popularize the view that the Republicans were a threat to the South, thereby encouraging its secession from the Union when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Well, this is a criticism. Gene H. Baker is one of the big critics of Buchanan. I'm not sure how much truth there is in what she's just said. She's taken an anti-Buchanan position. Gene H. Baker continues, quote, Besides his pronounced pro-Southernism, Buchanan's personality also damaged his prospects for a successful presidency. He had always been a cautious pessimist, lacking the ebullience that so often undergirds the boldness of good presidents. He remembered a grim verse that fitted his view of life. Will fortune never come with both hands full? She either gives a stomach and no food, or else a feast and takes away the stomach. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time. We'll wrap up the life of James Buchanan, Part 3, talk about his presidency and the beginning of the Civil War. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.